Hello, everyone, and welcome to the digital webinar series. My name is Eric Peterson, and I am at the University of Southern California, an associate professor in psychiatry and behavioral sciences, and the director of digital mental health for the CTSI here. Just a little housekeeping stuff. Just checking to make sure that everybody can hear us okay. If you don't hear us, send us a chat. But I just want to go over the questions panel. So for those of you who've done this before, this looks pretty similar to what you've seen before, but if not, there is this Q&A panel that you'll see on the right side. And so if you do have a question, please click on the Q&A tab and type in a question there. Our presenter today has asked to keep questions, to ask many questions, but we're going to present them all at the end. So he will finish up his webinar, and then we will go through the questions. So today's topic is how to get indexed in international citation databases. We're very excited to have our speaker today, who's Dr. James Greenwood. Dr. Greenwood is a very accomplished researcher turned entrepreneur. He holds a PhD in microbiology from UCLA and has several patents, peer-reviewed publications, and book chapters outlining his work. He is the editor at two prestigious journals, the Journal of Environment Science and Renewable Resources and the Journal of Environmental and Toxicology Research. Dr. Greenwood is working as an adjunct professor in the UCLA Fielding School of Public Health. He has joint appointments in the departments of epidemiology and environmental health sciences, and is a participating faculty member in the Institute of Environment and Sustainability. Previously, he served as the Assistant Vice Chancellor for Research Administration at UCLA. He's also served as the Environment, Health, and Safety Director for UCLA and Southern California Edison. So we're very excited to have Dr. Greenwood here with us today. Thank you for being here with us, and I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Greenwood.
Okay, thank you very much. What I'm going to do today, and we have a slide on the agenda, is go over the concepts of citation, and that includes references and literature citations. We'll further go into indexing of citations, which is very important nowadays in terms of ranking the accomplishments of people that are publishing, to give you an idea of how that works. Talk about the international citation databases and what they mean and how you can use them, and some of the downsides of citation indexing and the flaws, and then some tips for journals and publishers. And one of the things I'd like to mention is, since I have reviewed a number of papers, is the importance of good grammar and English for most of these papers. I have to say, we have turned down so many papers that have good science but are not easy to read. And so as I go through, I'll give you some ideas that I have on how you can get more things published and why you should publish in the appropriate journals. So if I could have the next slide, please. There's obviously a slide on disclaimer for this material. And then the next slide talks about the number of references a paper has, and it's a measure of the items of the biography and endnotes, while the citations have to do with how people reference your work. So they're slightly different. It's the same thing, but a little different. And we'll go into that with far more depth. So in terms of the concepts of citations, the slide I think it's number 10, starts with the citation. So when you do research, a citation is the text that's referenced and acknowledged by another study. So you're citing a study, and what that means is it shows how science is interconnected. All science somehow works together with other science. And so this acknowledges the fact that some of these ideas and concepts are already in the literature. And then Point number 3 is the list of references. And so this would be your list of references to a complete list of citations. And this is what goes in to the end of your article. So these are your references from your publication. So if I could have the next slide. So basically, the difference is if you publish something or write something, you cite other people's literature, and that becomes your citation. And if you look at paper C, if someone cites your paper, then that becomes a reference. So they're basically the same thing, but it depends on where they exist in the publication. So there's citations and references, subtle distinction, but an important one. So if you go a little further on slide 12, what should you cite? And that's a very important aspect of this whole process of publishing. Obviously, if you use someone else's data to make a point, you should cite that, particularly if you're doing a meta-analysis. Or if there's an article in a book or from a website of other people's material, that would be something that you would also cite if you use it. Or quotes from an author, tables and figures. Sometimes if you're giving a review and you have what you think is a controversial facts, you might want to cite someone else who agrees with you, or sometimes someone who doesn't agree with you, as a way to set up your discussion. And then obviously statistics. If you have numbers, if someone else has done a study and has statistics, if you cite those, that's also important, because it shows, number one, how interconnected your research is to other individuals, and you can build on what they have done if you further refine something. So if I could have the next slide, number 13, what you shouldn't cite. And so obviously you might have your own conclusions, but you can't cite those things or your own experiences unless you have data where you've actually published it. Or you can't obviously cite your own experimental results, because that would be part of the paper, which is the whole. And also what's called common knowledge. I mean, there's lots of things that people believe in, but if they're not really scientifically founded, you really shouldn't use that. So if I could have the next slide, number 13, why you should cite. And this is important. It's a very important, and I think probably one of the most important ones, if you look at the lower right-hand side, is to avoid plagiarism. If you're using someone's data, you need to give them credit for it. If you don't, you run the risk of having someone discover that you've put in something that you haven't done. It also provides evidence, as I mentioned before, supporting the arguments and claims for what you're doing. If you have found something and then in the literature review you've seen other people have found it, you can add those references, and that strengthens your argument. And to attain credibility, because you're showing that what you have found is part of good science, for instance, and that other people have similar findings. And probably lastly, to facilitate literature surveys. I mean, that way, as you probably know, when you pick up a paper and you come across some concepts that have been referenced, then you can look at those and further your understanding of that particular field. So what are the objectives of citation indexing? And if you look at slide 16, what you'll see is basically information retrieval through literature navigation. And that's fundamental to this. That way, you can help individuals find further information, as you do when you do a literature survey. So that's one of the major functions of citation indexing. And the other thing, which is becoming very important nowadays, is the impact of a published scholar literature. So it's not just the fact that you've published a paper, but is anyone using your information? Does it have any significance to the broader area of publications? This is important in particular if you're on an academic track and you can show that your work is relevant because other people are citing it. If you publish something and you have a paper but no one's using it, that gives the impression that the work that you're doing may not be that significant to the broader scientific community. If I could have the next slide, which is 17. So what's a citation count? And so citation count, as you see, is the frequency of an article cited by researchers in their articles. And so that's one of the basic issues that's been done for a number of years. It's just counting through the literature how many times something is cited. And the example we give here is the phenol reagent. That was a standard years ago, 1951, if you see that, of a method of looking at a biochemical method. You can see it's been cited by almost 250,000 people. That's a journal article with tremendous impact by its citation count. And then the citation analysis examines the impact of a publication, an author, or an institution. And I'll talk about that further as we go on. Now, in the digital age, there are a number of ways to look at that impact analysis, or a number of people trying to find ways to say, this research has more impact than another research. And it's also used as a reliable measure of the significance of the source of the information. So if you look at it the other way, if you're publishing in a journal, or let's say you have a paper and you're looking around for places to submit it for publication, you want to have a journal that has significant impact. As I'm sure many of you know, there's hundreds, thousands of journals out there, and you want to publish in something that gets noticed. If you're in an obscure journal and you have a good paper, but no one looks at that journal, you're going to lose the relevance of that particular publication. So it's important, and we'll talk about it later when we go on, why it's important to look, if you're looking for journals to publish, ones that have relevance. So if I can go to the next slide on a citation metrics, there are a number of journal metrics that people use nowadays. Impact per publication, if you see on the right, 5-year journal impact factor. The eigenfactor is something that was developed at the University of Washington that looks at network analysis to look at the influence of journals. If you look at the author metrics in the middle, there's the Hirsch H index, which Hirsch was a physicist at University of California, and it was individual, how to see productive an individual is on their contribution to science. And so there's a number of various ways to look at things and find out, not only for the individual publisher, but also for the researcher and for the journal themselves. On the right side, you see article level metrics. And one of the things now, as we're in the digital age, is people are looking to count how many times an article is downloaded, how many citations have been used. So there's all sorts of new approaches to find out where the good literature is, where the good researchers are that are publishing, and what kind of impact they have. And all of this, basically, since we're talking about the digital age, has come because of things being digital at this time. So if you look at the next slide, the importance of citation metrics, again, we've talked about this earlier. Why do it? Well, again, it's to evaluate the impact of papers, subject areas, or researchers, and identify high quality journals. And as I say, there are a lot of new journals, digital journals come about all the time, but the question is, as a researcher, do you want to put your article into one that's a new one, or try and get it into something that's more established? Haven't really talked about it, but also building collaborations. And that comes from people publishing in certain journals where all their collaborators also publish. And that would be if you're in a society like the American Society for Microbiology, you might want to publish only in their journals because that's where your peers are. And the other thing, as you see too, is a lot of funding depends on your publications, what you've done in the past, or if you have publications in an area where you're interested in getting funding, the more prestigious the journal, obviously, the better chance you might have of getting funding. And certainly, I can use the term publish or perish if you look at career progression for tenured faculty positions. Obviously, publications are very important, and the quality of the journal does count. If you have something in a very prestigious journal, that means the bar has been set high and you were able to get your research into that particular journal. So talk a little bit now about citation indexing. And if you go to slide 21, that was started by Dr. Eugene Garfield and from the Institute of Science Information. And he used to publish a book called Current Contents. I think it came out, if I remember, weekly, and it had just pages of the front page of every journal showing all of the articles, and started then collecting data about them. And so eventually, obviously now it's digital, but it's a way to show the resources that are available. So what you could do with the old Current Contents would thumb through on the journals that you were interested in, and in 20 minutes or 30 minutes, you could review 30 or 40 journals to see if there was any publication that you felt was interesting, and then you could go to that publication. Obviously now, that's all digital, and you can do that by just sitting at your desk. They're also called indexing or abstracting services, and they index metadata of scientific resources. And one of the things I'd also like to mention, just as a sidelight right now, is on the papers that I've reviewed and my colleagues have reviewed, it's very important to remember that the abstract that you write for the paper is extremely important. It has to be done very well because that's how you sell your paper in a short period of time. So somebody wants to look at it, and I'm sure if you do research, you'll know that you want to get a real feel for what's going on and what the conclusions are. And my impression is, or it's more than impression, people don't spend enough time on that aspect. They're glad to write the paper and send it off, but the abstract really needs to reflect what you have written and what your conclusions are. And so I've seen many abstracts that don't really get the point of the paper across to the presenter. So we can go on to the principles of citation indexing. And number one is sort of absolutely what I've been talking about, is that the knowledge from whatever discipline is always dependent or related on the tenets already accepted and established. So essentially, it's no paper stands alone. I mean, they have data. If you're using a method, even if you've established it yourself, it's because of using someone else's method and you've made it better. So it's part of this continuum. And it also helps you, if you look at number two, that the core literature on a given subject is contained only in a selection of journals relevant to the subject. So basically, all that's saying is when you go to the library, if you start looking, you don't start looking at every journal that's been published. You want to look at the ones that are core literature for what you're interested in, what you're doing. And so citation indexing is a way to make that a better process. And the third point is that basically one possible measure of the significance of research is the frequency of citation. So if you think about it to that Poland analysis, that was a significant finding, and one of the reasons you know that is because it's been quoted by everyone who's used it, you know, over 250,000 times. So right now, if you go to the next slide, there are three major citation indexes. Science Citation Index is the one that we've been talking about. 8,500 journal titles, social sciences citations, 3,000 journal titles, and then arts and humanities citation. And so when you think about it, this is a tough job. It's very hard to go through and look at all of these things that are published now and to capture them and to make sure that they're out so they can be noticed by other people. So it really, if you can think about it, it's a huge job, and the number of journal titles increases, I would say, almost weekly. So there's also international citation databases, and those are on slide 25, ISI, the Web of Science, Scopus, and Google Scholar. And I think Google Scholar has become very useful for a quick review. Obviously, they don't capture everything, but they capture enough. If you have a concept and want to see if other people have looked at it, Google Scholar is a very quick way to go. If I can have the next slide, there's also subject-specific citation databases. And So if you take a look at these, Computer Information Science, CiteSeer, Inspire for high energy physics, PubMed, which I use a lot, life science and biomedicine, astrophysics, data systems. So there are these also citation databases to direct you to things. If you're, for instance, if you're working in high energy physics, you probably wouldn't want to go, for instance, to Google Scholar, which is too broad. If you can go to something like a high energy Inspire and go through that quickly to see if there's anything in your field that's worth following up on. So there's also, if you look at the next slide, region-specific citation databases. Not as comprehensive, but they are available. As you can see from the chart, Russian Science Citation Index, not that many and not that comprehensive. So I think unless you're probably doing some sort of work that might have geographical significance, obviously they're available. I don't know how many people would use that all the time. Obviously, the next slide, why do journals index in citation databases? And basically three things. Authors need to distinguish quality journals from the predatory journals. Now, predatory sounds sort of strange, but there are numbers of low quality journals that are out there. And when you're deciding where to publish, you want to find journals that are obviously cited frequently. Now, and I've talked about that before. Why publish in something that no one looks at? And journals can index in a reliable citation database to establish their credibility. So that's the other side of it. If you're a new journal, to get into one of these citation databases, you have to start developing a consistent record of publishing. If you're a monthly journal, the citation databases look at that to make sure you actually publish monthly, and that in fact people start quoting you, so eventually you can get into one of these citation databases and help establish a journal. And they also have, if you look at the bottom slide, they have a set of criteria for indexing journals. You know, they just don't add them because they're a journal. They actually have the journal jump some hoops, which I'll talk about. So one of them, first one I'll talk about is the Web of Science. And as you can see in slide 30, it's a subscription-based interdisciplinary citation indexing service. It encompasses 159 million records, journals, books, proceedings, also has patents and data sets updated weekly, and they're available also in print. So it is a subscription-based system, and it does obviously cost money. Usually the larger libraries have subscriptions to it, but obviously you could get one on your own. And so they have databases within theirs. So if you take a look at slide 31, you can see they have some of the regional ones. So they host those. They host the patent and data collections. And then they also host things like specialty hosted collections, Medline, Food Science, Biosis, Current Contents, Select. So it's a indexing service of databases. So it's obviously very comprehensive. So if you look at the next slide, journal selection, they want to make sure that if you take a quality criteria, scholarly content, clarity of the language, which I've already mentioned, timeliness of the publication. In other words, if it's a monthly journal, they want to see that it's a monthly journal, that it's in journal format, that they have ethics statements, editorial affiliations, and author affiliations. So they want to make sure that what they put in there is good. And then they also do, as you see on the right, the impact criteria, comparative citation analysis, author citation analysis. So they want to put good things in. So there's also unsuccessful outcomes. So if a journal, maybe it's a new one, they allow people to resubmit. But for instance, on the failed editorial quality evaluation, sometimes they will embargo those. They essentially will say, you can't come back for 2 years because of that. And they want to make sure too that some of these journals of the low quality ones will sometimes plagiarize the article. It's not uncommon that might happen. And so if they discover that, they'll get embargoed from the Web of Science. So again, just another slide sort of saying it the right way, the editorial evaluation. And so they look at the editorial process. So that's important if you're selecting a journal. If it's already in the Web of Science, then you know that it has passed that initial screening and that it would be a decent journal to publish in. So the next one I'll talk about is Scopus. And Scopus covers has a large footprint. It's published by Elsevier, and it's the largest abstract and citation database of peer-reviewed research literature. And I'm sure, as many of you know, Elsevier is a major publisher of journals. I'm at the University of California, and University of California has actually cut using Elsevier because of the cost of their journals, which they feel are too high. So that's been an ongoing issue for a couple of years. But the other side of it is Scopus has 1.4 billion cited references going all the way back to 1970. And includes 5,000 publishers, 150,000 books. So it's a huge database, and it tracks impact of research, monitors global research trends, and so it's a very useful tool. And so the next slide, in terms of their pre-selection criteria, consists of peer-reviewed content. It's got to be published, as I say, on a regular basis. It's got to be relevant and readable for an international audience. And again, that gets back to the issue of making sure that when you submit something for publication, it really is readable and has publication ethics and a malpractice statement. And so that's important to get into one of these databases. It's almost, if you don't get into one of the databases, you don't exist. So the next slide just goes over that in terms of the journal policy. They look at the level of peer review, the diversity of the editors, the diversity of geographic distribution of authors. They want to make sure it has a long footprint, the contributions to the field, the clarity, again, of the abstracts, the readability of the articles, no delay in publication schedule. So again, this is what they do to make sure that things are adequate for their journals. And you can see on the next slide, so I won't spend much time on it, just shows the acceptance rate and the number of titles reviewed. So acceptance rate can be anywhere from probably 35 to 65%, depending on when. This is just a snapshot. So obviously, they don't accept everything that gets submitted to them. And I think that's one of the reasons why the quality remains high. So the reevaluation criteria, and again, this is what they do to look at somewhat again. For instance, if they have the site score, which is yearly average of citations, if you see down towards the middle, they have a number, 50%. It needs to be above that compared to the journals and their peers to be able to get there. So this just gives you a rough idea of how they look at things and how they reevaluate journals in particular that haven't been accepted. So in terms of Scopus versus the Web of Science, just a quick slide to show you how much bigger Scopus is than the Web of Science. Even, I mean, they're both very good, but obviously Scopus has a much larger footprint, 22,000 titles versus 12,000 for Web of Science, 5,000 publishers versus 3,300. Scopus is updated daily versus Web of Science weekly. And the next slide shows the geographic presence, and you can see Western Europe and North America are the big areas. Scopus has a bigger footprint in Eastern Europe and Asia Pacific than Web of Science. And so let's talk a little bit about the flaws of citation indexing, which is slide 44. The rich get rich and the poor get poorer. And what that actually means is, obviously, if you have a journal that's prestigious, New England Journal of Medicine, some of the others that are very prestigious, if you're a researcher and you're doing what you think is really first-rate work, you're going to want to submit there. So what happens is the journals that have the high rankings get more of the quality papers. So it tends to skew how people look at that. You know, if you're a hot researcher in a field, you're going to want to go for something that's going to get a lot of publicity and press. So as second bullet point says, high journal rankings are self-perpetuating, and that's true. And it makes it hard for new journals to break into the higher ranking. So that's also true. You know, if you're an established researcher and you've been publishing, for instance, in the New England Journal of Medicine or one of the other ones, why would you send something to a new journal that doesn't have the rankings? And so it's tough to get into it. And especially the other side of it is if you're an unknown researcher, even if you're doing decent work, it might be harder to break into one of those journals. And there is an Anglo-American bias. I mean, there's no question about that. And I think probably some of it has to do with language, as I mentioned, and non-English language citations are undercounted because they're hard for people to use, and so consequently they don't get into many of these citation indexing places probably the way they should. And if you go to the next slide about manipulation of journal rankings, number one, you see self-citations. So what sometimes people will do, they'll publish an article, really should be one article, but instead they cut it into 3 and then reference each other, the same articles. So they end up getting more citations and references because they're citing themselves. And journals also publish more review articles to increase the number of citations. So if you're doing a review article over some type of literature and you've looked at 300 papers on this review article, well, that turns out to be 300 references that then get cited. And so consequently, it's more than a paper that might only have 15. And so also the issue of speeding up the publication factor. And as point 3 says, some journals encourage citations from the same journal, which tends to increase the numbers. So a few things about some tips for journals and publishers. I don't know how important this is for many of the people in the audience, but some of the things that help, hosting systems that assist in publication of scholarly content, like journal articles. Systems help editors have real-time interactions with authors and peer reviewers, and they also allow easy verification and tracking of identifiers. The identifiers, for some of you, and there's a number of initials here, the DOI is a digital object identification or identifier. The others, the ORCIDs, are another type of digital identifier. Crossref is a non-profit that helps researchers make their research easier to find. So these are all systems that help journals get into the digital world and to identify them along the way. The next point I'd like to spend some time in is slide 49, avoid poor journal warning signs. And this is important because if you're going to publish something and you look around and you have all sorts of choices, take a look at what they've published. You know, do they publish anything that goes in their direction? Anybody that sends a paper gets published. And you need to know what the focus of the journal is. And I've seen and turned down a number of papers where someone sends in a paper, and it might be a good paper, but it really isn't appropriate for the journal and what the journal's trying to do. The journal, and they get turned down, but other journals that are getting started want to just fill the number of pages they have, and they'll take anything. That's not a journal that you want to submit to. And again, poor grammar. So if you're looking at the articles and you see it really hasn't had any decent proofreading, or you look at it flawed science, the figures look like they've been hand-drawn, or if you see something, and one of the big ones is obviously plagiarism. So those are things that you need to keep in mind when you're publishing in the digital world, because it really doesn't help you to be in a journal like that. Number one, it won't help your science get spread across to your colleagues, because nobody's going to look at that journal and it won't get indexed. So the next slide, the takeaway points, basically for publishers, make sure your peer review system is up to date. And so that means finding people that are on the peer review, that are editors that are actually working in the field and have some credibility also, so that when something is reviewed, you know it's been reviewed by somebody who knows what they're doing. Support initiatives to design and reduce academic misconduct. Obviously, that's important. Make sure you have clear instructions about paper submissions, and try and have a system identifying images that might be plagiarized for text, where usually what would happen is one of the peer reviewers would say, gee, I've seen this article before, or these data were already presented and they've been published here, or they're trying to publish here, and they don't have a reference to the work where they actually came from. So those are just important points for the journals. And again, the next slide on ethical points, gone over this before. Make it readable, work closely with the international organizations. The other thing is promote published papers. You want to be in a journal that does something, either sends out newsletters or sends emails to people about upcoming issues and what they're covering, because that would be a major help for you as a researcher. If you publish something, you want it out there so people can look at it. And in particular, with these indexing systems now, you want people to look at it or to download it or to do a share, so you get the fruits of your labor. And in terms of the slide number 52, why are citation indices required? I think it's pretty clear, covering on what I've talked about, really three things to assess the impact of an article, the author, or the journal. So there are three things that will help you stand out, or help your journal stand out, or your science. The indices also help you navigate and connect with literature and each other. So obviously, with thousands of journals, you don't want to spend all your time thumbing through things looking for that, where things that become indexed make your work as a researcher much easier. And then lastly, to look at trends in the field. If it's an emerging field, suddenly you start seeing people talking like COVID virus 18. How many papers are we going to see about that starting maybe next week? And that's going to start hitting the indices, and that's going to become a very hot research topic. And it'll show up there where those viruses didn't get much publicity at all, and pretty soon, and you'll start seeing the impact. So if I could have the last slide, which is thank you. So hopefully this is a topic that's been interesting to you. It's a little different, but it gives you an overview of looking at publications from the side of a publisher and from the side of an editor. and why indexing is particularly important, and how things have really changed in this digital age, how you can get far more information, as I'm sure all of you know, when you go to the internet, on looking at things and being able to drill down in data and find things that can be helpful to your research program. So with that, I will stop.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Greenwood. We do have a couple questions.
Okay.
So I'll read those out. This one is a comment, but I'm interested to hear what your thoughts are on this. So we have one that says, next to Web of Science, Scopus, and Google Scholar, there are some new large citation databases coming up, things like Dimensions, Lens.org, and Microsoft Academic. This person urges us to consider using these as well, but we wanted to hear what your thoughts are on some of those.
Yeah, no, all of them, it sounds like a cop-out, but they're all good, but they're all slightly different. And as I mentioned, for instance, with Google Scholar, it's quick and easy, and it's basically free. So that's a good one to start with. The directed ones seem to have stronger points. For instance, if you're into high energy physics, you might want to use those. I would recommend trying them all to see how they work with your particular area. I would never say don't use them. I'd say use them all and find out which one has more in your field that's relevant. And then you go by ease of use and cost, whether they have subscription prices or not. But yeah, no, and I think there's going to be more, because in a sense, in the digital age, it's becoming easier now that things are digital to start these databases as opposed to in the old print days.
That's great, thank you. And I'll just repeat that for those of you that are on the phone that are interested. This individual recommended Dimensions, Lens.org, Lens.org, and Microsoft Academic. And so if there are other questions, just type them in. I've got a few more here. We've got a couple more minutes.
Sure.
So we were interested a little bit in some of the things that you were saying in the beginning of the talk, in particular about the author metrics. And I was wondering what you thought of, the I-10 versus the I-20 versus the H-index. You listed a bunch there, and I know it's pretty subjective, and it's usually up to the university or who's ever doing the criteria for review. But in your experience, what is usually the best type of author metric out of those lists that you had?
It depends on the field, because there's different, as you say, there's lots of different metrics, and depends on what you're doing. If you're doing like the Hirsch H-index, which came out of more physical sciences, that's probably, based on the algorithms, a better index for those individuals than for others. So I think a lot of it really has to be specific to the field. At least that's has been my experience.
Great, thank you. Okay, so another question. So, you talked a little bit about predatory journals. So what is the deal with predatory journals? Where do they come from? And are you able to find those in Scopus as well?
They shouldn't be in Scopus, because basically they don't have the criteria that they need to, as you saw, the hurdles to jump through. I think it's easy to start a digital journal, and I think many of them have tried or do with publication page charges, so they can actually get money, but they don't have really an editorial board. They will take anything, and if you look around, you can find them. The charts and graphs look like they've come off of Xerox machine. I don't think it's a big problem, but I think it exists. And I think what happens is it makes it harder for legitimate new journals to get started because they don't have, they don't have what Scopus needs, for instance, to get a ISSN number. You have to have a track record of publications, and you have to go through and they actually interview some of the editors and things like that. So not a major problem, but it's something that in particular researchers that are starting out need to be aware of so they don't waste what could be a decent publication in something that's never going to get seen and then probably can't be published again since it was already published.
Sure. Okay, great. Thank you. How about just one more question? I think, it'd be helpful to pick your brain as a journal editor. Something you had said about, the importance of the abstract. And I know we have, many researchers on the call that are trying to get their work published. And I mean, in my own experience, the abstract is something that I usually write last, as I'm submitting because, I'm so exhausted from the paper. And so I just wondered if you could give us some advice on, how to get that done. Is that something that you just try to copy from maybe the first paragraph of this discussion, or just some tips or how to craft that so that it's more.
To me, you need to sort of sit back, and I know I've done the same thing. You want it out of your office, and you put it down and you throw a few words and send it off. But it really, in a sense, is a sales pitch for what you're doing. Why is this work important? What have you found, and how did you find it? As opposed to just, putting in some of your final thoughts. So I see it more as a pitch. Why would I read this article? And what have I done that is different and thought-provoking? So it takes, I guess it just takes a little more thought than taking your first 3 sentences and your last 2 sentences and putting them in and say, the abstract is done.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, and it's helpful to hear from an editor too, who is, the first line that the paper goes to know that this is something you look at and you really got to sell the editor in order to make it past that first step. So that's really helpful.
Yeah, exactly.
Great. Thank you. Okay. So I think with that, we will conclude. If anybody has any lingering questions, definitely let us know. And we really look forward to hopefully seeing you at our next webinar. And I just want to thank Dr. Greenwood once again for sharing his time with us. And thank you. Hope everybody has a good day.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you.
All right. Thanks. Bye-bye. Stop recording. Stop recording.